Hello everyone, we're going to be looking at brush strokes today, and the first brush stroke that we are looking at is the dry brush technique. And how we do this is with a brush that is not very wet, it's slightly damp, but we use direct paint. So I'm loading the brush with just paint on my brush and applying it. You get fairly textured brush strokes in this technique. The next technique we're looking at is called wet on wet, and the way we apply this technique is by first of all using a clean brush, applies water, preferably clean water, to the surface, and then dab in just pure colors in the areas where you've applied the water. What happens is you get a really interesting merge of different colors and interesting tones of colors. Notice how the paint looks after it dries. The next technique we're looking at is called glazing. The way we apply this is by mixing somewhat darker tones, darker colors, and the paint here is slightly wet. You mix it a little more with water, and the brush is damp as well. Let us wait for it to dry and we will come back to that. The next technique here is called sgraffito or combing, and first we apply an area with the paint, and you can see how the paint here is mixed well with water and it moves easily on the surface of the paper. After that, we use a sharp object, or here I'm using the end of a brush to etch, and this is removing some of the paint to reveal the surface below, and you get interesting textures this way. The next technique we're looking at is the layered technique. I'm showing you here how one area of the this box where I'm talking about layered technique brush strokes with pure red, and the difference of what it would look like with layered paint. I'm starting again with the same process of applying the first layer of color. When the paint is still wet, you mix in other colors to merge those colors in together. This technique is called layered. This allows for smooth transition, sort of blending within the colors when the paint is still wet on your surface. As you know, acrylic colors can dry really fast, and so this is an interesting technique to mix the colors immediately on your surface. As opposed to mixing the colors on your palette, you mix the colors on the surface of the paper. This next technique is called scumbling, and the way we approach this technique is by creating circular motions of brush strokes, and I'm not pressing my brush too hard on the surface, just hovering just over the surface of the paper. You will also notice that the paint is fairly wet. It's not as loose or wet as the wet on wet technique, but you can move the paint easily around, and it's not as dry as the dry brush technique. Here you can see as I'm moving this paint around, just as in the layered technique, I'm not waiting for the paint to dry. Each color is still wet as I'm introducing a new color. This way I can merge those colors together to create sort of a misty feel. Coming back to the glazing, now that the first layer is dried, I'm applying a wash of loose paint, just as we did on wet, except I've mixed my color in on my palette with the water well. As opposed to wet on wet, we're applying only water first and then adding just color. Here I'm mixing a fairly loose amount of paint mixed with a lot of water. This technique allows us to create tones, a translucent screen over the first layer of paint. So you can see the first layer of brushstrokes under this top layer of a wash of paint. The next brush stroke technique we are looking at is stippling, and this is important to note. The brush here is damp, but it is not wet. As you can see, there's no water coming from that brush. And when we load the brush, we are just going to be taking the tip of the brush with paint and just a little bit of paint, and we can create interesting textures this way. When applying on the surface also, we are only using the tip of the brush to create those textures. This last brushstroke technique is fairly similar to a few others. Here I'm using sort of a dry brush stroke. The brush again is as damp as I would use it for stippling, and I'm only applying it so that the edge of the applied paint is soft, and you can see it's almost a misty, grainy edge. This is opposed to the hard edge where the brushstroke is quite clean and crisp, and this is why it's called a hard edge. You can see the difference between the soft edge and the hard edge. The hard edge, I have used a mixture of water with the paint, and that's why it moves easily on the surface of the paper. The next brushstroke we're looking at is dabbing, and the way we approach this is by using short strokes, mixing the color with a little bit of water, but fairly thick paint also. This creates texture, and you can see the brush strokes, the bristles of the brush evident in the brush stroke. Just as we did in layered technique, we are mixing the color also directly on the surface of the paper, but you could mix your own colors on the palette and experiment. The brush stroke is by creating short strokes by dabbing the brush on the surface. This technique of brush strokes is called washing, and the way we do this is by mixing the paint on your palette with a lot more water. The paint is quite translucent, and we wait for the first layer to dry before moving on to next layers. Again, the same way, the second coat of paint would be mixed well with water before applying it. Now you can see how the second layer is translucent, and you can almost see through to the first layer of paint. Make sure to wait for the layers to dry before moving to the next ones. Here I'm applying another layer of a different hue, a different color on the surface, and you can see how some of it merges and blends.